The Orient seems to beckon tourists. Europeans are delighted to be sailing to Egypt or Palestine to gaze upon the wonders of history, the pharaohs and Alexander the Great. Just over the horizon near Port Said flows the Suez Canal, designed by Ferdinand de Lesseps during the 19th century. A port of call. The passengers alight, breathe the desert air, ride camels near the Gizeh pyramids. The Gumo Film Company sets its publicity panel before the Sphinx. Cairo is a wonderful example of Islam at its best, with her beautiful mosques, her large bustling avenues, and her tiny winding lanes reminiscent of the 1001 Nights. Muslims, Copts, and Jews live side by side. In 1913, the Torah is carried to the new synagogue. But to buy a rug, you have to examine 100. Faithful to their traditions, the people still manage to adapt to the new techniques the West is imposing. And now on toward the Red Sea and Aden, Arabia. The sharp contrast between the ancient felucca and the steamship churning up the canal. Jerusalem, Palestine, and the Holy Land are still under Turkish rule. Christian, Jewish, and Muslim pilgrims rub shoulders in crowds of believers, seeking solace amid the holy places. But the actual control of Jerusalem is a passionately debated issue. Is this rallying point a way for the three religions to meet and communicate, or to annihilate one another? The Wailing Wall, the Mosque of the Dome, and the Nativity procession in Bethlehem are such symbols of renewed hope. Coast-hugging schooners and international steamships all sail toward Beirut, the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa. The Levant, the part of the Orient closest to Europe, is a geostrategic zone now called the Middle East, created to protect the British Empire's Indian possessions. It stretches from Afghanistan to the Persian Gulf and borders the Turkish Ottoman Empire and the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. Mount Lebanon villages line the ancient track that leads to Damascus, with its tremendous steps and its towering summits. Capital of the Turkish Ottoman Empire for over 6 centuries, Constantinople is a proud city, despite the recent drawbacks in Africa and in the Balkans. Milan, September 1911. The Italian army attacks the Turkish Ottoman Empire and lands near Tripoli. Italy joins the ranks of the colonialists by annexing Libya with its ancient traditions and brutal living conditions on the edge of the Sahara. Despite the Caliph's weariness, there are officers of the Young Turk Party in Istanbul who dream of resistance and uniting all the peoples of the Islamic Orient. Kaiser Wilhelm II, who already has an eye on Mosul and Baghdad, will lend his support to their opposition of the British, the French, and the Russians. By 1914, the Turks have become Germany's allies. France sends troops to fight in the Dardanelles and then Salonika to help the Serbs. The British Army of India lands near Shatt el-Arab, takes Bassora, but encounters resistance from all the Arab tribes of the valley of the Euphrates who have rallied to the jihad war cry against the invaders. The Russians are protecting the oil fields of Baku on the shore of the Caspian, using the Caucasus as a war base to attack. The Turks defeat the British in Mesopotamia in 1916, but with reinforcements, the Imperial Army mounts a new offensive in Iraq. Crossing the Tigris, it enters Baghdad in March 1917. It parades through a silent and sullen city. The mullahs of Najaf and Karbala, the holy cities of the Shiite Muslims, are already preaching sedition, and soon the population will revolt. The rebels defy the might of Britain and its bagpipes to save their souls and their civilization. The peasants are forced to dig trenches while the conquerors sip soda water. However, the British managed to win the Arabs over by making a considerable ally. Hope has sprung up in the western region of the Arabia Peninsula, where the proud and brave Emir Faisal has become commander of the Arab army of the north before Medina. He belongs to the Hashemite family who have always controlled Mecca. Colonel Lawrence arranges for the British to support the Arab revolt. He is standing beside the emir, wearing the same robes as his hosts. Faisal has a noble ambition: to unite the Arabs despite regional and tribal differences, unify the Arab provinces of the Turkish Ottoman Empire, and create a single kingdom. But as he is assembling his army, France and Great Britain have already come to terms with the Sykes-Picot Agreement, whereby they have decided to divide up all the regions between the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf into zones of influence. Moreover, British Secretary of Foreign Affairs Lord Balfour has already told the leaders of the Zionist Federation that his government is amenable to the establishment of a Jewish nation in Palestine. After two unsuccessful offensives against the Suez Canal, the Turks are beginning to lose troops. Holding Egypt, the British army attacks. In the steps of Napoleon Bonaparte, it takes Gaza and enters Palestine from the north of the Sinai Peninsula under General Allenby. So many contradictory promises to keep or to break, with Jerusalem barely in view. December 11, 1917. A motley, curious crowd awaits the Allies. The British cavalry parade is swiftly followed by French and Italian troops to demonstrate everyone's presence. The official cortege has been the object of strict protocol. Two French officers are walking behind Allenby. The second one is Arabist and Islamist Louis Massignon, who said, "Our entry to Jerusalem desacralized the holy city." Lawrence was so shocked he said, "Do you believe I have any respect for the high command?" Upon which he mimed opening his trousers to urinate. The French army crushes the Germans' allies, the Bulgarians, in the Balkans. Istanbul is undone. The Turkish government abandons its dreams and signs the Mudros Armistice in October 1918, capitulating before the Allies. General Franchet d'Espéré triumphantly enters Istanbul. Paris acclaims the victors of the World War. Clemenceau greets President Wilson in Versailles, where he has come to negotiate the peace treaty. Wilson, whose contribution to the Allies was essential to victory, proclaims people's right to determine their own government. Détente and negotiations. Several delegations from the Levant have come and gone, trying to make their aims known. Faisal wants an Arab kingdom with its capital in Damascus. He signs an agreement with Clemenceau January 6, 1920, but it is already too late. November 21, 1919. General Gouraud lands in Beirut with a large troop contingent. The High Commissioner of the French Republic for Syria and Cilicia, Commander-in-Chief of the Levantine Army, is acclaimed by the crowds, amongst which there are many Christians. Is he a liberator? The French army bears the laurels of victory. In April 1920, Foch and Weygand attend the San Remo Conference in Italy. The Syrian mandate is awarded to France, the Mesopotamian and Palestinian mandate to Great Britain. The mandates will be ruled in the name of the Society of Nations. According to its international principles, the mandates are to prepare the subdued nations for independence. The Turkish government has abandoned its sovereignty over the Arab provinces. The British troops, which have occupied Syria and Lebanon since 1918, gladly move on to territories governed by Great Britain. Standing on the steps of the Résidence des Pins in Beirut, a disabused Faisal faces Gouraud. He must leave Damascus after the defeat of his troops at the hands of the French Imperial Army in July 1920. But the tempest of revolution is blowing in from Bolshevik Russia. Proletarians of all nations unite. Lenin wants all the colonized nations to follow the example of the proletarian West. Once again, the Soviets show a sense of showmanship as they reclaim the Volga, the Caucasus, and Turkestan. However, Tatar Sultan Galiev is already distancing himself from his comrades and considering Muslim communism. The Congress for the Peoples of the Orient takes place in September 1920 in Baku, reclaimed by the Red Army. But how essential are Marxist ideas to peoples who are primarily striving to found a nation? During these times of revolutionary thought, divided though they may be, the Arabs are nonetheless united by their faith from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. In Arabia, Abdulaziz ibn Saud proclaims his theocratic intentions and seizes Mecca in 1924. In Asia Minor, Greek troops land in Smyrna and occupy the interior in 1919. Venizelos intends to claim this region of the former Ottoman Turk Empire for Greece. But he did not foresee the intentions of an energetic Turkish general who is trying to restore an independent nation, Mustafa Kemal. He sets up headquarters in Anatolia, expulses the French army from Cilicia, regroups all the partisans, convokes the Grand National Turkish Assembly, halts the Greek offensive, and retakes Smyrna in 1922. He is honored with the title Ghazi, which means victorious. The armistice of Mudanya signals Greece's defeat. The press confirms that there is a new power to contend with. The large Greek population of Smyrna is forced to flee in long lines of refugees, like the Armenians before them. In Istanbul, the representative of the Kemal government is acclaimed by the population. The religious dignitaries have no choice but to comply with Ataturk, father of all Turks. Mohammed VI, the last sultan, flees the country. His title, as that of Caliph, are abolished. Mustafa Kemal, elected president of the Republic of Turkey, makes Ankara his capital. In Persia, where the influence of the Anglo-Persian oil company is great, the last descendant of the Qajar dynasty power is Said. Despite a fantastic decor, the country is in social, political, administrative, and financial chaos. In 1921, the weak Shah Ahmed is deposed after a coup. Colonel Reza Khan proclaims himself Shah, thus founding the Pahlavi dynasty. And if the citizens of Palestine wish to travel, the British Mandate government delivers a passport which bears Palestine in English, Philistin in Arabic, and Eretz Israel in Hebrew. Jerusalem is calm, but the quiet will soon be disturbed by loud cries. Now a British protectorate, Egypt was part of the Ottoman Empire until 1914, but was occupied by the British Army since 1882. Egypt is swept by a feeling of great national fervor. Its leader is Saad Zaghloul, whose family are farmers near the Nile and who often depend upon the goodwill of the aristocracy, composed mainly of the descendants of the Turks. Saad Zaghloul heads a delegation, the Waft, at the 1919 peace conference and then to London to propose an independence and reform program. He is acclaimed by an enthusiastic population upon his return in 1921. But even the still veiled feminists greet him in the Bay of Alexandria. The people of Egypt are warm-hearted, proud to have their own leader, and obviously amused by his speeches. These demonstrations convinced the British to grant Egypt its independence under certain conditions in 1922. A new liberal constitution is adopted. With the electoral triumph of the Waft, King Fuad asked Saad Zaghloul to form the first parliamentary government. Egypt thrives, both economically and in the arts, with writers such as Taha Hussein. Upon leaving Syria, Faisal becomes king of the new state Iraq, which is governed by the British Mandate. He has adopted Western clothing. His brother, Emir Abdallah, reigns over Transjordan, also under British Mandate. The oil discovered near Kirkuk must be protected. The Iraq Petroleum Company, formed with British, Dutch, French, and American capital, builds a pipeline to the Mediterranean. The largest oil fields are near the Persian Gulf, which is controlled by the British Navy. The state of Greater Lebanon was proclaimed September 1, 1920. Liberal but often awkward, General Serrai is named High Commissioner in 1925 and arrives at the Résidence des Pins. He has to deal with the Syrian Arabs' demands. The insurrection begins in the Druze Jebel. It extends to Damascus. The nationalists demand their independence and the creation of an Arabic Greater Syria, free elections to form a constitutional assembly and a national army. The French army subdues the revolutionary movement and bombards Damascus. Meanwhile, the Republic of Lebanon gains a constitution. But the Syrians must be negotiated with in order to bring back peace. Their aspirations for a nation must be listened to. With this in view, General Serrai is replaced by Senator Henri de Jouvenel. From Aleppo to Damascus, the Syrian Republic draws upon its heritage and implements its modernization. The Franco-Syrian Treaty is negotiated at the Quai d'Orsay and signed September 9, 1936.
C'est avec une joie profonde que je salue en cet instant la renaissance de l'État arabe de Syrie au passé légendaire et que je lui offre les vœux de prospérité et de grandeur qu'inspire à la France l'amitié la plus sincère.
In the presence of Léon Blum, Pierre Viennot and Syrian Hashem Atassi signed the treaty. It is immediately ratified by the Parliament in Damascus, but not in Paris. Near the Jordan River, Arab legionaries are drilling and training. A time of tragedy is about to beset Palestine, where the British Mandate authorities have not allowed a nation to be created. Jewish immigrants from Europe are extending their agricultural colonization using equipment that is new to this region. The Zionist ideal of a return to the land of Israel is often influenced by socialist or Western democratic thought. Happily building villages and cities for their collectivities, they imagine that they will finally attain day-to-day peace, far from the anti-Semitic dangers of Europe. But are their actions good for the other Palestinians, or rather erasing them from the land? Strength is their knowledge and the use of Western techniques. To ensure this, they found the University of Jerusalem. Lord Balfour attends the inauguration. As Hitler comes to power in Germany and Nazi persecution increases, a new wave of Jewish immigrants floods the Promised Land. To cultivate it and populate it, and their willingness to work justifies the egalitarian spirit of the kibbutzim. But the Palestinian Arabs take a dim view of the colonization from which they are excluded. Amin al-Husseini, Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, reminds them of a common past, brought them into one force. All the Palestinians unite despite the various social groups. By 1936, the uprising has a national flavor. British troops are sent to put down the insurrection. There is already talk of creating two separate states out of Palestine. King Farouk dies in Cairo in 1936. Same year, the remains of Saad Zaghloul, who died in are transferred to the mausoleum that was erected in his honor. The Wafd is still the active government party. Young firms one and all, at home as well as abroad, and Prime Minister Nahas Pasha obtains a treaty with Great Britain, granting Egypt military and judiciary sovereignty. The rigorous attitude of a new movement, the Muslim Brotherhood, gladdens the hearts of the people who have sent a veil to cover the Kaaba in Mecca. But Great Britain still retains the strategic bases that allow her to control the Suez Canal, thereby protecting her lines of communication. Great Britain is increasingly alarmed by fascist Italy's colonial ambitions. Italy's conquest of Ethiopia deprives her of an ally, but worse, Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, the Upper Nile, and access to the Red Sea are threatened. Mussolini visits Tripoli. The natives dance, but only the colonialists are cheering. He also has his heart set on Tunisia. Egyptian green shirts give the fascist salute before the pyramids. Their movement is encouraged by the Italian radio in Bari, transmitting in Arabic. Great Britain and France are alarmed. Even if the Egyptian fascist parades fail to attract the people because of their Western influence, German propaganda pays them great attention. Dr. Goebbels visits Egypt in early 1939 in civilian clothes. Protests in Palestine have not decreased. To neutralize the situation on the eve of global conflict, Britain publishes a white book stating her intention to reduce Jewish immigration and to create a single state in Palestine for all the different communities. The Jews oppose this program. By the beginning of 1939, the French deputies still haven't ratified the Franco-Syrian and the Franco-Lebanese treaties concluded in 1936. Gabriel Puot is named High Commissioner in Beirut. His mission is to prepare the Mandate territories for a period of war. He is told to hold this part of the French Empire and to protect the oil route. The Syrians are outraged by the French, who have just turned over Saint-Jacques d'Alexandrette to Turkey. Masigli signs in Ankara. Vigan, Commander-in-Chief of Mediterranean Operations, already considers the Levantine ports of strategic importance in case of a conflict with the Soviet Union. Vigan is suddenly called back to France in May 1940 to oppose the German offensive. He fails to do so, accepts the armistice, and becomes one of Pétain's ministers. Syria and Lebanon are now under Vichy government control. Both countries can be extremely useful to Germany. When the Germans take Crete in the spring of 1941, they threaten all the eastern Mediterranean. They are supporting Rommel's forces in Libya, who are opposing Great Britain's troops in Egypt. After visiting Hitler at Berchtesgaden in May 1941 and speaking for Vichy, Admiral Darlan authorizes German planes to use the French military Air Force base at Aleppo in Syria to support the anti-British movement in Iraq. The tanks of the Indian Army are sent against the Baghdad troops who are attacking the British base at Habanya. The Arab Legion, commanded by Englishman Pasha Glub, marches in through the desert from Transjordan to aid the Iraqis. The British defeat the Iraqi army, but many years later, its young officers will take their revenge. British Imperial communications are safe in Iraq. Syria and Lebanon remain. At dawn, June 8, 1941, General de Gaulle's Free French joined the British troops. Facing them, a well-armed French army under Vichy orders, commanded by General Dentz, the High Commissioner appointed by Pétain. Darlan orders him to hold. The fratricidal fighting is dreadful, and Vichy propaganda makes full use of it. De Gaulle, conscious of the British government's attitude, intends to maintain France's influence. In his name, General Catroux officially recognizes the governments in Damascus and Beirut. Beirut is bombarded. This useless struggle must end. De Gaulle insists on France keeping her civilian and military responsibilities till the end of the war. Catroux undertakes delicate negotiations with the British. July 1941, the British sign a convention at Saint-Jean d'Acre, allowing the French regiments still loyal to the Vichy government to embark for Marseille, which they do, under the Australians' watchful eyes. By this time, the Wehrmacht has already invaded the Soviet Union. Grand Mufti Amin el-Husseini flees Baghdad, where he has been in exile since 1939, and travels to Berlin in 1941 to pay his respects to Hitler. Of all the Arab dignitaries forced in exile, few will commit this same blunder. Meanwhile, Rommel, the Desert Fox, defeats a British counterattack in Cyrenaica. Regrouping, he sends the Afrika Korps off toward Tobruk and Egypt, dragging the Italians along behind him. Free France is still resisting, fighting alongside Great Britain. Her troops take Kufra, a Libyan oasis. While the Wehrmacht is fighting its way deeper into Africa and pushing back Soviet lines toward the Caucasus, de Gaulle flies to Syria and Lebanon in August 1942. He views Hama on the Oronte River. Greeted by General Catroux, he reviews his troops, then pays his respects to the President of Lebanon, Alfred Nakash. Never was a French leader greeted more enthusiastically by the crowds of Beirut and Damascus, people having traveled from afar to see him. There will then problems with both Syria and Lebanon as their demands of complete independence increase. But for the moment, a sense of historical greatness far outweighs the spitefulness of political sniping. Appointed commander of the 8th British Army, Montgomery halts the Afrika Korps 100 kilometers west of Alexandria. El Alamein, October 23, 1942. This is the turning point. Rommel is defeated. His retreat to Tunisia. Nazi propaganda created arrogant warriors. Defeated, they look like all the other vanquished peoples of the war. With their incredible industrial, the Americans land first in North Africa, then in Italy. The Red Army stops the Germans at Stalingrad on the Volga. In Iran, Reza Shah seems to have been with Germany's nationalism and military might. The Imperial Indian Army intervenes, thus protecting strategic positions and British oil reserves in the Persian Gulf. They march past a silent mass of the population. Diplomats leave the Reza Shah abdicates in 1941. But the British still have to contend with a competitive ally. The Red Army invades and of the Two armies meet face to face. But the Soviets have become more preoccupied with the events in the Caucasus, where local leaders are beginning to assert their independence on the aegis of the occupying German forces. There are conquests, reconquests, and various zones of influence. Mohammad Reza Shah succeeds his father. He is accompanied to his palace under heavy escort. The British Army controls both the refineries and the oil reserves of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Getting the oil out is vital to both the war effort and Great Britain's economy. In Tehran, in November 1943, Stalin acts like he owns the country when he greets his guests. Actually, the Western leaders managed to obtain Iran's independence mainly so the Soviets won't stay. But Stalin wins an immediate objective. Roosevelt promises to open on the French coast of the Channel, although Churchill is in favor of an offensive in the Balkans, which, at the same time, would prevent a further Soviet advance. After the defeat of Nazi Germany, difficulties loom between the Western democracies and the USSR with its domination over the East. In Fulton, Churchill predicts the beginning of the Cold War.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
The horror of the Nazi camps will also affect the Arabs. The surviving Jews hope to find peace in Jerusalem. Will Europe agree to assuage its guilt? During the war in the United States, the Zionists actively campaigned for Jewish immigration to Palestine. More to the point, the Irgun sets a bomb in the King David Hotel, the seat of the British administration in Jerusalem. 91 bodies will be found amid the ruins. The Mandate authorities try to contain the terrorism, but it is submerged by illegal immigration entry. The League of Arab States, founded in 1945, declares that it is no less indifferent to the sins of the Jews in Europe as of dictatorships, but that is no excuse for the Christian and Muslim Arabs of Palestine to become victims. It demands a united, independent Palestine. Despite the all-shown image of the Exodus in 1947 and the sympathy evoked in the West, no one seemed to understand that the Jew misfortune was also becoming the Arabs' misfortune. Will the reality of the Palestinian people be eclipsed by the stress of the illegal immigrants? And should Palestine be cut in two to create a Jewish state? At the nation, the states are against it. Speaking for Saudi Arabia, Faisal defends. The partition is voted November 29, 1947 by the General Assembly of the United Nations.
Abstain. France? Yes. Soviet Union? Yes. United Kingdom? Abstain. The United States? Yes. Yemen? No.
As the fighting continues, the British government announces that it is pulling out its troops, the mandate having ended. Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion proclaims the State of Israel May 14, 1948. The Jewish immigrants have become Israelis. Ibn Saud and Farouk, as Arabs, feel betrayed. The Arab Legion, still under Pasha Glub's command, marches past King Abdullah of Jordan. Separated one from the other and ill-prepared for a conflict with the determined, organized Israeli fighters, the Arab armies begin the war. The Israelis enjoy a further advantage, shorter lines of communication. The Haganah and the Stern Group massacre the village of Deir Yassin, a terrifying memory for all the Palestinian refugees. The UN sends a mission headed by Count Bernadotte of the Swedish Red Cross to stop the fighting. His solution is to propose an Israeli-Arab federal union encompassing all Palestine. He meets opposition from extremists of both sides. While the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood sends partisans to fight in the south, fought over, the Legion takes all its winding streets and UN mediator he and the refugees be allowed to return to their homes. He is vilified by part of the Israeli press. Bernadotte is assassinated in Jerusalem, September 17, 1948, by men wearing the Israeli uniform. Arab resistance has failed. It is time to let wounds heal. Israel has won. The fighting diminished progressively from the beginning of 1949. Armistices were signed at Rhodes between Israel and the different Arab states which had been at war. Abdullah of Jordan integrated the Transjordan territories with his kingdom, as well as the holy places of Jerusalem. He prays at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. A Palestinian will assassinate him there in 1951. Any Jew has the right to settle in the new state of Israel. Its society is militarized out of necessity, and the troops maneuver with great pride. An enclave in the Arab Orient, Israel is admitted to the United Nations. The representatives of the states leave the assembly in protest. However, Aban are to stay, but the Palestinian refugee problem lingers on. The Israeli government still refuses to let them reclaim their land and their homes. The camp generation will produce militators and engineers. They have lost everything save their sense of identity. They will invest in education, resistance to. On the other hand, Israel is organizing air bridges to recuperate Jews from Iraq, Yemen, and the Maghreb. In 1950 in London, the Western powers decide to limit arms sales to Israel and the Arab states to protect the existing borders. The Arabs feel persecuted. The United States are following President Truman's doctrine to weaken Soviet advances. Having rebuffed since 1945, Turkey becomes NATO in 1902. Its new prime minister, Menderes, has gotten rid of the Kemalists and now has the trust of West democracies. His army is equipped with American arms and military materiel. But the cavalry is still reminiscent of the steppe Cossacks. Iran and its oil reserves must still be held under surveillance because the Soviets want to control part of it, and the refinery of Abadan supplies Western Europe. As early as 1946, Iran's wily Prime Minister Gavan negotiated the departure of the Soviet troops with Molotov in Moscow. At the same time, he re-established his country's suzerainty over Azerbaijan and Iranian Kurdistan. One of the great landowners, Mossadegh, reappears on the political scene and proposes the nationalization of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The people are enthusiastic. He becomes prime minister in 1951 and accomplishes what he had proposed to do. He gains great support from the Muslim faithful with the help of the Shiite mullahs who are opposed to foreign economic interference. boycotted. The British fleet is in the Persian Gulf. Mossadegh's resources are cut off. He goes to the United States to plead his case before the United Nations and to obtain an American in vain. The new American administration is concerned about the Tudeh, the Iranian Communist Party, which, after having attacked Mossadegh, has now decided to support him against the United States. In August 1953, General Zahedi deposes Mossadegh with CIA assistance. The anti-Shah demonstrations are put down by the army. Mossadegh is arrested and then brought to trial. Although sick and weakened, he finds quite enough energy to defend his policies. In the Middle East, he becomes a symbol for those who wish to acquire their independence and limit foreign interference. In Egypt, Farouk is giving this a lot of thought. The government resents 1930. Beneath the statue of Suleiman Pasha, the people of Cairo demonstrate against British occupation of the Canal Zone. Great Britain establishes 75,000 troops in the area to protect the waterway. The Muslim Brotherhood sends ill-equipped volunteers to harass the British. They in turn hunt down suspects and take repressive measures, thereby increasing the population's hostility. Barbed wire is never enough to halt the process of decolonization. European families are sent home. The British Army commands the streets of Ismailia. In January 1952, the British seize the Bulak Nizam barracks housing the auxiliaries of the Egyptian police. There are demonstrations and arson in Cairo. Many young officers, considering that they had been betrayed in 48 and 49 during the struggle against Israel, are convinced that the new movement must take place in Egypt. They call themselves free officers and organize in secret. Muslim sheikhs and Copt priests join their movement. July 23, 1952, the Egyptian army topples the government. The revolutionaries are led by General Naguib, who is very popular with the crowds. But the real leader is Abdel Gamal Nasser. Farouk abdicates and goes into exile. In Iraq, the increase in oil revenues has allowed the Hashemite monarchy to endow great works. Fast to his coronation of Faisal II, May 2, 1953, Iraqi opposition vehemently denounces the government's corruption and repressive ways. The same day, Faisal's cousin, Hussein, is crowned king of Jordan. He is only 17. The West must now contend with the increase of nationalistic movements and the anti-imperialist views and attitudes of the Arab world. The presence of American Secretary of State John Foster Dulles is felt in Egypt. But does the old British imperial lion still have enough teeth to keep the Suez Canal? The people of Cairo, massed around the Al-Azhar Mosque, expect miracles. The city is experiencing an incredible demographic explosion and an economic boom. Nasser, too, was born in a rural environment. Now head of state, he initiates an agricultural reform program that allows him to redistribute land to the peasants and simultaneously weaken the position of the great landowners. He is now strong enough to dismantle the Muslim Brotherhood accused of attempting a coup, and by now, women are engaging in hunger strikes to obtain their rights. The United States pressured Great Britain into signing an agreement with Egypt in July 1954, in which ships to evacuate this canal with 20 months. The Egyptians are relieved. Through occupied zone since 1882, at long last, they are embarking. if Egyptian government's single-party stations are ideological, Nasser has become all the Arabs hope his station into from the Atlantic. There is fighting near Gaza. The world is reminded of Israelis' ambitions and the fate of the Palestinians. Is humiliation always necessary? Egypt needs modern arms. Where will she find them? Nasser refused to join the pack of Baghdad because he did not want to be submitted to Western strategy. But in April 1955, he attends the Afro-Asian Conference in Bandung. Indonesian Sukarno gives him the chance to figure on the international scale. Nehru, at the height of his fame, teaches him non-alignment. As for the arms the West refuses to sell, he advises him to seek help of the Soviets. The deal is made, and the USSR increases its presence in both Cairo and the Middle East. Starting in June 1956, the Egyptian army is bearing Soviet-origin Czech weapons. Nasser also intends to build a dam at Aswan to irrigate, electrify, mobilize the nation. The West refused to grant him his loan, so the canal will pay for the dam. He nationalizes the Suez Canal Company July 26, 1956. He will finally feel vindicated. Their honor is restored. The canal will be now controlled by Egyptians. In London, the British and the French, who have been dispossessed, propose that the canal be declared international. Nasser ironically refutes this attempt at international colonialism. Israel attacks October 29, 1956. Was the nationalization of the canal really worth a war? The Israeli government has convinced the British and the French to begin a joint military action against Egypt. Israel's main aim is to annihilate an Arab army that the Soviet materiel might improve. Great Britain is mainly concerned with protecting her last imperial possessions. France, in the grips of the Algerian War, wishes to stop Egypt from assisting the Algerian FLN. The coalition's explanations before the UN Security Council are weak. The British and the French are operating out of bases in Cyprus, on Malta. The Israelis seize the Gaza Strip, reducing an already humiliated people. Moshe Dayan is in the Sinai. He accepts an Egyptian general's rendition. Israeli soldiers proudly display captured Soviet materiel. British commandos and French parachutists enter the fray. The British High Command still seems to believe it is 1944. While Soviet tanks are finishing off the last of the Hungarian rebels in Budapest, the British and French armies are bombarding Port Said. At the entrance of the canal by sinking boats. Ferdinand de Lesseps' statue is blown up. The vast contingent of French parachutists exasperates the United States and nourishes Soviet propaganda in the Middle East. By November 2, 1956, the United States convinces the General Assembly of the United Nations to vote a motion demanding the cessation of hostilities and the evacuation of the Sinai by Israeli forces. Golda Meir declares that her country accepts the motion. Burns heads the UN forces sent to take their position between Egypt and in the Sinai. The troops in blue helmets are acclaimed like liberators. The Egyptian military has become a resounding political success. They evacuate. The French troops soon follow. Their unfortunate endeavor has hastened the fall of the colonial empires. Nasser has become the hero of nationalism, and from Port and Alexandria, the European are going home.